All right, so last week we began to look at a very disturbing vision from Daniel. He was sleeping in this dream, and we saw it in the first part of chapter 7. He saw in succession 4 great beasts. We had the lion with eagle's wings, a bear that was raised up on one side with 3 ribs in its mouth, a leopard with 4 heads and 4 wings, and finally a huge fearful beast unlike all the rest with teeth of iron and 10 horns on its head. Now, he was given the interpretation by an angel who happened to be standing nearby that they represented the 4 big empires. So we don't need to go through them again. We know they were Babylon, Persia, the empire of Alexander the Great, and the Roman Empire. And then, of course, a picture of another beast, or a horn rather, that came out of the 10 that basically is the world dictator at the end of the world. And then the vision went to the judgment of this horn, okay, and a judgment of the world system, and the enthronement of Jesus Christ the Messiah, and Jesus in his glorified body ruling now in glory and righteousness. Okay, so if you have your Bibles with you, go ahead and turn back to Daniel 7. We're going to be starting in chapter 19. Now, this is the nitty-gritty stuff. This is a lot of the stuff that people just really like to dig into. Okay? As we start talking about what the book of Revelation refers to as the beast, what Paul talks about as the man of perdition, or as most of us are referred to as the Antichrist. Okay? Now, what's interesting here in this latter part, even though Daniel sees the end, he sees Christ, he sees the Lord triumph over all, and you have this calm declaration by the angel, the prophet was still disturbed by what he had seen. Okay, and I think I'd be too. If I had a dream like that, I mean, that blows your mind. But he really had some questions about that 4th beast with the horns. Not so much the Roman Empire aspect of it, but the glimpse he had of that 5th empire energized by Satan that would dominate the world for only a short time, fortunately. And what Daniel's concern was, because it mentions how the saints, and that would include at this point the faithful Jews, are going to be persecuted again. Now, no Jew likes that thought that, we're not done yet. I mean, you think about Jewish history, all that has happened to the Jews since the fall of Jerusalem in AD 70, the persecution during, the anti-Semitism that took place throughout Europe, throughout a good portion of the Middle Ages, the Spanish Inquisition, which, if you were a Jew, you were clearly anathema. They had wanted nothing to do with you, and they would devise all sorts of horrible things to do to you, to make you die in pain. And then you had, of course, the Holocaust in our own century, and you still have the Jews under attack. Today, they're back in their homeland, which, by the way, is a miracle of itself. Now, some people kind of push it aside and poo it, but no, you have a nation that had been driven out, and almost 2,000 years later, they're back in their homeland as a nation. And a very strong nation at that. They're probably the most stable democracy in that part of the world, and the most powerful nation of its size in the world. And the Arabs have discovered that many times since 1948. And so obviously Daniel, he's looking at this and he's like, what's going to happen now? They're going to face more persecution, and what's going to happen? So he's giving his attention back to this beast. So let's look at verse 19. Then I wished to know the truth about the 4th beast, which was different from all the others, exceedingly dreadful, with its teeth of iron and its nails of bronze, which devoured, broke in pieces, and trampled the residue with its feet. And the 10 horns that were on its head, and the other horn which came up, before which 3 fell, namely that horn which had eyes and a mouth which spoke pompous words, whose appearance was greater than his fellows. I was watching, and the same horn was making war against the saints, and prevailing against them, until the Ancient of Days came, and judgment was made in favor of the saints of the Most High, and the time came for the saints to possess the kingdom. Thus he said, the 4th beast shall be a 4th kingdom on earth, which shall be different from all the other kingdoms, and shall devour the whole earth, trample it, and break it in pieces. The 10 horns are 10 kings, who shall arise from this kingdom, and another shall arise after them. He shall be different from the first ones, and he shall subdue 3 kings. He shall speak pompous words against the Most High, and shall persecute the saints of the Most High, and shall intend to change times and law. Then the saints shall be given into his hand for time, times, and half a time. But the court shall be seated, and they shall take away his dominion, to consume and destroy it forever. Then the kingdom and dominion and the great kingdoms under the whole heaven shall be given to the people, the saints of the Most High. His kingdom is an everlasting kingdom, and all dominions shall serve and obey him. This is the end of the account. As for me, Daniel, my thoughts greatly troubled me, and my countenance changed, but I kept the matter in my heart. Okay, again, a lot there. All right? So, Daniel regarded, he like I said, he heard all about it, he looked at the 4th beast, but he comes back to it. He is so focused on what's happening. It's like, okay, what's happening here? Who are these 10 horns? And what's this little horn that emerged and overcame God's people? And despite the assurance of the ultimate victory that would be the Lord's and his people would finally prevail, Daniel was concerned. It's like he's already seen the conquest of Judah. He saw what Babylon did to it. Even though it was relatively peaceful time, even he himself was a victim of prejudice, if nothing more. But he also knew some of his people were still persecuted because they were Jews. And so he's looking, it's like, isn't it ever going to end? And the answer, of course, gives, no, it's going to end at some point, but there's going to be something going to happen. So the angel zeroes in on the little horn and his rise and fall and the second coming of Jesus Christ. Now, the angel referred to the Roman Empire, which was markedly different from the 3 preceding empires, Babylon, Persia, and Alexander the Great. Now, it's not going to be so much in size that the Rome is different. If anything, the Roman territory, and I didn't know this, but I found this from several sources, a territory controlled by Rome at its height in AD 117, where it extended from Mesopotamia all the way up to Britain, and the north coast, all around the Mediterranean and all the coast of the Atlantic, up to the Danube River, the Rhine River. All this territory, it was actually smaller than what Alexander had conquered. Okay, and I guess a lot of it is the maps are a little different. But Alexander, his empire went from Afghanistan and parts of India all the way to the east to Greece, okay, and to Egypt. Huge empire. No, what he was talking about, what this angel was referring to, is that this empire was much better organized, okay, very well organized, and it was united in such a way that it was able to endure for centuries. Okay, the last vestiges of the Roman Empire didn't fall until 1453. Okay, the Roman Empire was around for over 1,000 years. Whereas of all the previous empires, the longest lasting was the Persian Empire for 200. Okay, that's interesting to know. Okay, Rome lasted for a long time. And of course, when they're talking about conquering the whole earth, it's basically the known world, the Middle East and the areas around it. And then he moves on to this 10-horn phase, okay? Now we jump from our past to the future. And we kind of went through this last week. But we want to understand kind of who this little horn is. Okay, we already mentioned it. He's a world ruler. We call him the Antichrist. And let's look at that name for a minute. Christ means Messiah. That's the Greek word for Messiah. And anti, the prefix, has two meanings. The first meaning means against, so he's against Christ, but also instead of Christ. Okay? So the term Antichrist has two meanings, and they are not mutually exclusive. This person is going to be against Christ, and he is going to place himself as an alternative to Christ. So he's going to be counterfeit. He's intended to replace Christ in some point in the future. And you don't have to turn there. If you want, hold your finger here in Daniel and turn to the last book of the Bible, Revelation 13. Okay? John describes the appearance of the man of sin in Revelation 13, starting in verse 1. I'll give you a moment to get there. Revelation 13:1, yes. Then I stood on the sand of the sea, and I saw a beast rising up out of the sea, having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his horns 10 crowns, and on his heads a blasphemous name. Now the beast which I saw was like a leopard, his feet were like the feet of a bear, and his mouth like the mouth of a lion. The dragon, and by the way, the dragon is Satan, gave him his power, his throne, and great authority. And I saw one of his heads as if it had been mortally wounded, and his deadly wound was healed. And all the world marveled and followed the beast. So they worshipped the dragon, who gave authority to the beast, and they worshipped the beast, saying, "Who is like the beast? Who is able to make war with him?" And he was given a mouth speaking great things and blasphemies, and he was given authority to continue for 42 months. Then he opened his mouth in blasphemy against God, to blaspheme his name, his tabernacle, and those who dwell in heaven. And it was granted to him to make war with the saints, to overcome them. And authority was given him over every tribe, tongue, and nation. All who dwell on the earth will worship him, whose names have not been written in the book of life of the Lamb slain from the foundation of the world. If anyone has an ear, let him hear. He who leads into captivity shall go into captivity. He who kills with the sword will be killed with the sword. Here is the patience and the faith of the saints. Now jump down to verse 16. He causes all, both small and great, rich or poor, free and slave, to receive a mark on their right hand or on their foreheads, and that no one may buy or sell except one who has the mark or the name of the beast or the number of his name. Here is wisdom. Let him who has understanding calculate the number of the beast, for it is a number of a man, and his number is 666. Okay, so 2 places we have pretty much the same description of the same fellow. Okay, clearly these people are the same. Now, according to Daniel, you can go back and turn back to Daniel 7. According to Daniel, the Antichrist has to overcome the power of 3 other rulers to be able to do what he wants to do and what Satan has planned for him to do. Now, the mention of his eyes on the horn, the mention of these eyes, suggests that he has remarkable knowledge and skill in planning his exploits. The guy's not going to be an idiot. The guy is going to be smooth. He's going to be actually very charismatic, actually very convincing. Revelation 13 kind of hints that this guy will be a military genius, since the world believes that no one can stand up to him. He's going to be skilled with words and be able to promote himself so that people will follow him. Okay? He's going to be blaspheming God and ultimately convince the unbelieving world that he himself is God, and will become the ruler, and will not only control the economy by the mark of the beast, so people who do not worship him cannot buy or sell, so they're basically excluded from the world economy, but he also seeks to change the religion. Everyone must worship him, and to change the times and the laws. Okay, Now, the little horn is going to he's claiming divine honors, okay? He's going to abandon all pretense of permitting freedom of religion and will revile the Lord in the heaven and the earth. And what's going to happen? He's not going to just one day appear and suddenly say, okay, Christians are bad, everybody's got to turn against Christians. At this point in time, no one would do that. No, freedom of religion. I mean, yeah, Christians are kind of overall are reviled by the world system, but at this point, no one's willing to say, as the world as a whole is going to say, no, we need to get rid of Christians. No, what he's going to do is he's going to oppress them or wear them down. And I hate to put this to you guys, it's happening today. Okay? It is happening today. We don't have time to talk about the prevailing philosophy of the world today. It's growing stronger. It's already deeply embedded into the educational system at all levels. And it's referred to as humanism. Okay, as the name implies, it's basically a human-centric set of beliefs. And again, we don't have time to really talk about it, but what we're going to find is that one of the main precepts of humanism is there are no absolutes. Okay? What may be right for you may not be right for me, or neither of them may be right for somebody else. Okay? There is no absolute truth. And they realize, people who are engaged in this, have been trying for almost 100 years to displace Christianity as the foundation of Western civilization, which always has been since a long time ago. And unfortunately, in many times, they've succeeded. Okay? And what's going to happen, we're not going to have soldiers busting down the doors of our homes and shooting us or arresting us because we're Christians. No. What they're going to do is they're going to be, churches and people are going to be forced to adapt, or they're going to be pushed out of relevance. Because this is something I found as an interesting quote. It is easier to die for the Lord, if put to the choice, than to live for him under constant harassment and strain. Okay? Now, as I said, and I will freely admit, going back to when I was a teenager, we had talked about this. I went to a Christian high school, and we actually talked about what the future was going to look like. And at that point in time, and this is the late 70s, early 1980s, so I have revealed my age, we didn't talk too much. We didn't think the world was going to go downhill as fast as it has. Though it was interesting how many people, we were talking about this idea, someone had said, oh yeah, do you realize by the year 2020 there's probably going to be 3 genders? No, there's 81. We'll get to that in a second, okay? He was way off, okay? The pace is so slow, it's unnoticed. Okay, it's like the story of someone has as an example is you put a frog in water, and if you slowly heat up the water just a little bit at a time, the frog doesn't notice it until the water gets so hot. Now it's too late. The frog tries to get out but ends up dying. But the heat has been going up for a long time, and then suddenly, whoa, what just happened? That's an interesting point, but that's what's been happening. Right now, we see this change in Western culture and belief, which is a signal of what we're going to be having to deal with. And humanism, as I mentioned, is now through most of our educational system. Okay? And as I mentioned, the idea of absolute right or wrong, absolutes, shall we say, is anathema to the humanist society. Okay? And a good example is this whole concept. Think about if there's no absolutes, the whole concept of gender identity. Now, we know there are 2 genders, male and female. Okay? But no, it's not absolute. I can identify whatever I want. As I mentioned, there's 81 recognized genders now. Now, the sad part about this sounds foolishness to most logical thinking people. Because as you think about this, well, no, there are certain things that define a gender, and sorry, men and women are different. Just ask a doctor medically, women have different issues than men do. Men cannot be treated for women's issues. Now, the sad part about it is because of the way that this humanism has permeated government and institutions, it is illegal for a doctor to say that. If a man comes in and he says, I identify as a woman, the doctor can't say, sorry, you're a man. He has to put down that he's female. And has to treat him accordingly. And yes, can get sued, and in certain states can get in trouble.
How can you do that if it's really not a female?
Because the law supports it. Because the idea of there's no such thing as an absolute. It goes back to even gender is not an absolute. Okay, I mentioned this once before, the whole concept of a transgender female lesbian is merely a man who likes women. Yeah, you have to think through that. That's what it is. I guess a man who likes women likes to wear a dress too. I don't know what goes into it, but that's basically what it boils down to. If you dissect every one of those 81 genders, it all goes back to 2, just in some weird, twisted way. But the thing is, the government, you hear, they used to call it a sex change operation. It is now referred to as gender-affirming surgery. And yes, in many states it's against the law. If someone wants to have one of these surgeries, it's against the law for anyone to tell them they can't have the procedure. Okay? This is interesting. Doctors can't base their diagnosis on a simple fact that there are 2 genders. And what's interesting is this gender-affirming surgery, those people who have the surgery have the highest suicide subset anywhere in the country. Why? Because you're trying to define that gender is fluid when it is not. We've talked about this, how every single culture, and this is something that people who try, and I've witnessed this in the schools as a teacher. Every single time someone says, there are no absolutes in the universe. What's your truth is my truth. And I remember engaging someone in discussion of this, and my response to them are saying, oh, so you're saying it was okay for Hitler to kill 6 million Jews? And their jaw dropped. It's like, well, according to you, because he thought that was right, he was right. And therefore we have no right to condemn him. Now, the scary part is, according to humanism, I'm absolutely right in that statement. We don't have a right, because the ends justifies the means. Now, of course, at that point, the person says, well, no, that's not, no, you can't have it both ways. Either there is absolutes or there isn't. Points that there are absolutes. One, every single culture in this world, I don't care what point in history it was, and where this culture was, there have always been rules against murder, against stealing, against adultery, believe it or not. Okay, if you wanted to be a polygamous relationship, that was something else. But adultery, it's a big no-no. Okay? You look at the 10 Commandments, you will see corresponding rules elsewhere in different cultures all through history, including cultures in the middle of the Amazon. Okay? There is absolute right or wrong, whether people like it or not. Okay? Enlightenment says, oh no, that's not true. Another thing we find in the schools is revisionist history. History that has been rewritten so that people cannot remember the lessons of the past, and more importantly, are not taught the greatness of their heritage. Okay, now granted, all heritages have issues and have problems. No one's perfect. But good things that are called bad, and bad things are called good. Okay, I think the most interesting one I've seen was the change in Britain of demonizing missionaries from the 17th, 18th, and 19th century. Jesus said to go to all the world and preach the gospel. During especially the 18th and 19th century, Britain sent out missionaries everywhere. Okay? Africa, the New World, China, wherever there was a field, they went. Okay? Now they're saying, oh, those guys were wrong. They were merely trying to judge that their culture was better than this culture down here, which they had no right to do. Okay? Because there are no absolutes, remember? And they were merely opening the way for imperialist exploitation. Yes, this is what's in the history books today. Okay? Even our own government, even our own history has been rewritten. The U.S. Constitution and the Bill of Rights, for example, are said to be outdated products of dead white slave owners who also slaughtered Indians, instead of being the most liberating document in history. Okay? And of course the Magna Carta, same way. It's interesting how this is changing. And the fact is, no one noticed, and I hate to say it in many cases because no one cared. When 30 years as a teacher, we've had to go through, I don't know how many textbook adoptions over the time. We've always had times for people to show up before we adopt a textbook for parents to review the materials. Okay? And yeah, I would have to be there for a couple of hours some night and have all these textbooks out with a few of my colleagues. And you can count over the 30 years I was doing this on the number of parents who showed up on one hand. Okay? On one hand. Less than 5. Okay? Because, and I think, maybe saying that no one cares is a little hard. But to be honest, I think they're just being too trusting. Oh, it's okay. Don't have to worry about it. But look at what's been happening. Now, religion is taught in the schools that it's a personal thing. It's a matter of opinion. And therefore, religion can't sit there and say they are the only way. And you may have even heard this from non-believers. Well, what makes Christians so wonderful that they're the only way? What about Buddhists? What about Islam? What about, all these other religions they talk about? I always love, what about the guy in the middle of the Amazon that's never heard anything? It's like, it's one of these things that people say, no, you cannot go out and teach that your religion's better than others. There are laws in some countries. And this is in countries where the gospel may have not penetrated everywhere, that you cannot contaminate their culture with your religion. Okay, if you run across a village of people who've never heard the gospel, in certain countries it is illegal to share the gospel with them now, today. Okay? Because important distinctions also between these cultures have been minimized. All cultures are of equal value. Okay? Think about the big brouhaha over Columbus Day. Oh, that's a horrible day because that's when the Europeans arrived and they pressed all their religion on Latin America and so forth. They had no business talking about how horrible the Aztecs were because they had human sacrifices. You're telling me that's a good thing? Well, there are no absolutes, so therefore, if they do it, it's okay. It tells you, it's like this is something that I get frustrated as a former educator, okay? But it frustrates me how many people swallow this hook, line, and sinker. And you see it even go into the churches. I mean, our own churches, I know our church, and I know Generations Church, and I know Calvary Severe Valley, they give to missionaries. Because they know the work that they do, no matter where they are, is important. A lot of the mainstream churches don't give to missionaries anymore because that shows intolerance. That shows that, you're trying to convert someone to your religion because you think it's better. Okay? See, all beliefs are said to be of equal value. And they don't give you really a way of discerning which values might be better or worse. Now, history teaches otherwise. You lose your value system, your civilization collapses. Period. It has happened over and over and over. Because of this falsification of history. Remember, they're rewriting history so people don't learn the lessons from history, because of this falsification, communism. Notice how many people talk about how wonderful it would be to be a communist country? How socialism will be the answer to all our woes? Well, it's because communism has been minimized and exalted despite the fact that it was responsible for the slaughter of over 100 million people in the last century. All the purges in Russia between the First and Second World Wars. All the purges in China. Anytime a nation was taken over by a communist regime, there was a complete purge of all the intelligentsia in order to maintain the new control over government. So, and you see this on YouTube too. You hear these people talk about how, capitalism is condemned as a great evil of exploitation devised by white rich men, despite the record of having provided the most prosperity and freedom for most of the people in history. Communism can't say that. Exactly. I mean, all you have to do is look at North Korea. That's why I wonder, have you ever been to North Korea? It's a communist nation. Well, China's communist too. A different form of communism. There's a lot more capitalism in there than you think. Why is that? Give that a thought for a while. I heard a person recently ranting on the failures of the U.S. railroad network, and there are many. Okay? There are a lot of issues with the railroads today. But his answer to the problem was nationalize them. Okay, look back in your history books and see how well that worked. Look at Britain. Right after World War II, they nationalized their entire railway network. It worked so well that they privatized them in the 1980s. It didn't work. In essence, it didn't work, and they privatized them because they knew private industry could do a better job. So in my mind, this writer was young and either not familiar with the inefficiencies of nationalized railroads, or he just didn't care about the facts. He figured, hey, I know what communism can do, quote unquote, so this is the way we should go. So that's interesting because a lot of people, it's interesting how many people here in our own country are so worried about the stability about our democratic system. Now, we are a republic. A democratic republic is a contradiction in terms. It's not the same thing. We are a republic. But it seems like, according to most people, especially on the left, our republic is on the edge because of people on the right. MAGA, Made America Great Again, is a dirty word. Okay? It's an insult to people. Why? Why is it when people want to make their country great? Why? Humanism tells you why, because humanism is global. Humanism wants nothing to do with national aspirations, is looking forward to a one world government of peace and safety. That is their goal. So socialism is now the new democracy. Interesting. Free market is evil. And in reality, this belief system goes back to Marxism, only it's what I would call Marxism light. All right? And what's scary, virtually all the major English-speaking countries, including our own, have accepted the major tenets of Marxism to some degree, without a struggle. Okay? And what are these tenets? Atheistic government with no influence from religion. That sounds like ours. A slow, steady push toward the abolition of private property in the name of the common or collective good. This includes abolishing any rights of property inheritance. And even though it hasn't gone far in our own country, elsewhere in Europe and in other countries, this is growing. Okay? It hasn't taken hold yet, but it's growing. The population must be disarmed for their own safety, of course. Okay? Mm-hmm. Government must maintain control over education and over what is taught. Mm-hmm. Heavy progressive taxation on income and goods, i.e. sales taxes, must be ever increasing so that the government can afford to, and go to our next point, maintain control over its citizens' lives from womb to tomb, including national health care systems, guaranteed living wages, and constant surveillance on activities in private lives, all in the name of peace and safety. In essence, the law is becoming a means of defending the government from the populace rather than the populace from the government. This is humanism. And what's scary is once it's in place, you can't reverse it.
And once you give up your firearms, you can't reverse it.
Exactly.
Or your rights.
Well, yeah, once you look at, for example, healthcare, okay? They've tried to reverse Obamacare, okay? And I'm not saying it's evil, horrible, or so forth. It's not national health care. But it's in place. It's part of our lives. And pretty soon, and in fact, at this point, no one really cares anymore. They just pay their health insurance and move on. That's kind of what I do, okay? I know what it intends. Doesn't mean I don't use it, okay? The worldview looks at this. They're very hostile to religions. And strange as it may sound, they say, well, not certain religions. No, any monotheistic religion, that includes Christian, Judaism, and Islam. It's interesting. They basically are against any monotheistic religion because, one, they're a fascinating mix. Now, this may sound like a contradiction. They're a mix of atheism and pantheism. Now, what's pantheism? That's the idea that God is everything. Thus, all gods can be worshipped. Okay? Now, if you're atheist, it means there is no God. Now, it sounds contradictory, but remember, there's no absolutes. Every time you run up to, well, there's a contradiction there. Oh, no, there's no absolutes. That's why they can believe both of them. What they do say is there is no personal God that cares about his creation. And so this is why there's no absolute truth. There's no absolute law. Right and wrong, God never said anything about it. So it's up to somebody else to determine what right and wrong is. But what's interesting is right and wrong can change. It can slide up and down. And traditional religious beliefs are now being labeled as extremist and radical. Do you know that this church is a radical fundamentalist church? Because we teach the Bible.
Amen.
Yeah.
Hallelujah. Isn't that crazy?
It is.
Crazy to me because, I'm like, wow, just because we go,
Exactly.
The government tried to take over the Christian schools years ago when my kids were going to a Christian school.
Mm-hmm.
And I wrote Reagan a thing with the little girl praying.
Now, here's what this system projects itself. Humanism projects itself as a utopia. Above religion, and in fact, and this is another point of religion, they view religion as a major cause of all the world's problems. You hear this, from the missionaries on back. They point at the Crusades. How many people died in the Crusades? Because one religion decided they're better than somebody else. Okay? It's a recapitulation of the failed Marxist beliefs from 100 years ago. And because of the change in history, how history is taught, nobody remembers it. So no, Antichrist is not going to turn everything upside down and seize power and make people freak out all of a sudden. The stage is set. So he is going to be given that power freely and with cheering. There was a line I remember from a movie where basically an emperor has declared an empire, and the whole Senate is shouting and screaming and hollering in cheers. They're happy. And I always remember the line. One senator says, "So this is how liberty dies, with thunderous applause." And that's what's going to happen. Oh yeah, there are going to be people who are going to be against him. He's going to have to use military power because it says he's going to uproot three horns or three kingdoms. But the people who are going to resist him, he's not going to be fighting after Christians or anything like that. There's going to be other people out there that want his power, and he's going to be fighting against them. By this point, of course, I'm going to assume when that starts happening, the true church is going to be out of the picture. Okay? However, there are still going to be believers. Those are the ones who are left behind, to coin a phrase. The ones that didn't believe. The ones that been sitting in church all their lives and essentially, as I put it, wrote on the coat heads of their parents' religion or their parents' faith, but never made the choice themselves to accept Christ. So they've heard the word. They know it. And they're sitting in Bible-believing churches. And then what happens? Suddenly all the Bible-believing people are gone. The rapture's taken them away, and suddenly, boom, they get it. And they give their lives to Christ. You're going to have 144,000 Jews that are going to act as missionaries. There are going to be believers during the Great Tribulation. Okay? And they're now the new targets. Okay? They're... Yeah. Exactly. And that's our job, is to plant those seeds. Because even if they don't give their lives to God or to Christ before the rapture, they'll remember enough from us to realize they were right, and they will be saved in and of themselves, even though it's not going to be fun. So, you see, it's going to be a fairly simple process for this world dictator to take over. And, of course, he's going to impose this new legal system based on totalitarian principles in which the service of the government and the state is going to be substituted for any absolute standards for God's moral law. All opposition and decisions of policies of that little horn will be legally considered treasonable and punishable by death. Simple as that. Now, here's an interesting point. Believe it or not, there is a place for Christianity in this new system, as long as it conforms to the new values, which will be forever changing. Okay? The church that compromises. Religions will not be permitted to, 1, claim that they are the only way, 2, have absolute truth of any kind, or 3, attempt to force their beliefs and value systems on the culture at large. So no evangelism. Those minor considerations aside, religion will be permitted to exist in the new system as a personal thing, as long as it yields to the prevailing political correctness. Notice that's the way it is today. And it's just going to get worse as it goes on. Now, what about changing the times? That's changing the laws. Long time explaining that. Changing the times. We see now the connection here. Okay? If you can't yet, let me let's show a little more light on this. He's going to try to do a revision of the calendar, this Antichrist. Well, why would he do something like that? Well, we kind of take the calendar for granted. Most of it, we just don't think much about the names of the days or the months. And even in Daniel's time, that's why this is interesting that Daniel put it in here. The calendar changed every time a new king came to rule, because the years were based on the number of years the king was in power. The 3rd year of Nebuchadnezzar, or the 4th year of Belshazzar, or the 19th year of Zedekiah. That's how they used to count years. What is our calendar system based on today?
Jesus.
Exactly. Birth of Christ. In fact, the official name is AD 2022, in the year of our Lord 2022. What this is referring to is that the 0 point of our calendar was supposed to be when Christ was born. Now, unfortunately, the guy who did this did about 500 years later. He kind of got it wrong. Christ, if we look at Luke, Christ was actually born sometime between 6 and 4 BC. But nevertheless, the whole point was the 0 point, and by the way, there's no year 0, is the birth of Christ. Our calendar is based on Jesus. Now, they've tried to secularize it since then. By instead of saying AD, they say CE for common era, or BC instead of before Christ, BCE, before common era. And then they added a 0 to separate it. Okay? But that still doesn't change the count of the years. Here's the thing. It's still based on Christ. So what's going to happen? Well, this new leader is going to celebrate his era. So the calendar goes back down to 0. And he might even change the calendar even more. He might eliminate the 7-day week. Because the 7-day week, remember, 6 days that God labored. On the 7th he rested. So it's a holy day. Okay, can't have that. So maybe have it 6 weeks. Or maybe the French revolutionary calendar. This has been done before for similar reasons. During the French Revolution, the French developed their own calendar to remove religion completely from their system. And it had 10-day weeks. Okay? And they had the months named on basically on weather and so forth. But people didn't like it because they knew they were going to get a rest every 7 days. Now they can only get a rest every 10 days. And in 1806, Napoleon reinstituted the Gregorian calendar, so that went bye-bye there. Even the Russians tried to do the same thing after the Russian Revolution. Obviously, it didn't last. This one is going to last, but it's not going to last too long. Now, changing New Year's Day. Well, to be honest, it's happened before. It has? Oh, yeah, back in 1752. There was a change from the Julian calendar to the Gregorian calendar in Britain, and at the time, the 13 colonies here in America. And New Year's Day, before 1752, started on March 25th. Okay? Very close to the spring equinox. It was actually astronomically based. So then they changed it to an even more obscure day, January 1st. Why? Well, in Rome, that was a day that a lot of changes took place each year. Usually that was the end of a term for legislatures and magistrates and so forth. So for some reason, the Gregorian calendar decided, let's go back to January 1st. Now, it was developed by the Roman Catholic Church. I guess they figured, why not? And, of course, if you wanted to be on that calendar, you had to do the same thing. And seasons, well, too long about that, but seasons were not when they start now. Ever wonder why in some cultures June 20th is called Midsummer's Day when it's really the first day of summer? Because it didn't used to be the first day of summer. First day of summer was around May 1st. And what minor holiday is on May 1st? Anybody know that trivia question? May Day. Mm-hmm. And why is Halloween on October 31st?
It's All Saints Day.
All Saints Day on the 1st of November, but that's when winter used to start, was on November 1st. There's always a little minor day where those seasons started. February 2nd, Groundhog Day, was when now that made sense with Groundhog Day. If the groundhog sees a shadow, there's 6 more weeks of winter. Well, that makes sense now because, that used to be the first day of spring, was February 2nd. And so, okay, that makes sense. It would be when the spring equinox would begin around the 20th between the 20th and 21st of March. That's 6 weeks. Now it makes sense, but these days it doesn't. So we don't know what he's going to do, okay? But we do know, as I said, that Antichrist is only going to have 3.5 years. This is according to Daniel 7:25 and Revelation 13:5. And this is a significant period of time in the prophetic scriptures. Okay, that's the time, times, and half a time, or the 42 months. So this period is half of a 7-year period that marks, or half of a 7-year period that marks basically the last, what we're going to get into in 3 chapters, the time of Jacob's trouble. Okay.
The second half of the trib?
So he's going to, essentially what's going to happen is the first half of the tribulation period is he's going to be given power, but he's going to use it wisely, i.e. there's not going to be this horrible dictatorship. But remember, everything's moving smoothly according to the humanist agenda. So there's no radical change of beliefs. Everyone's falling for it. But the first 3.5 years are probably going to be an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. Okay? It isn't until the second part when he goes into the temple in Jerusalem and declares himself to be as God. During the first 3.5 year period, the Jews, he's going to make a covenant with the Jews. Okay? And we're going to learn that in Daniel 9. He's going to make a covenant for 7 years. Okay? He's essentially going to be their protector. He's going to allow them to rebuild their temple in Jerusalem. And no, it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have to tear down the Mosque of Omar, because a lot of the Jewish scholars have discovered, no, the temple wasn't where that mosque is. It's actually further to the west. And so they can actually build it there, and you've seen this in some movies, how the United Nations basically protect it as a international religious site. But then the Jews can start the whole process of the sacrificial system and the Mosaic law and so forth. But halfway through that, in 3.5 years, He's going to break the covenant. He's going to go in there, cause the sacrifices to stop, begin persecution, go into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, have an image of himself made. And this is out of Revelation 13. We didn't read that section. Going to have an image to himself made. A false prophet's going to give life to that image and cause the world to worship him.
So when I'm doing Revelation,
We're going to go more into detail when we hit that part of Revelation, because there are things that are going to happen during that first half, but it's so easy. For example, everybody blames global warming for brush fires, this, that. He's probably going to do the same thing, okay? People sit there and worry about asteroids hitting the earth. Well, the way I read part of Revelation, that's going to happen, okay? Yeah, we're not going to be here, but we hopefully we'll have a front row seat to see it happen. But the thing is that it gets worse once you hit that second half, where everything's unplugged. Plus, remember that there are still going to be people who are not going to be for this guy. And again, I'm not talking about Christians. I'm talking about people who want power. Okay, there are going to be other just as unscrupulous people out there who are basically going to say, no, we're not going to take this anymore. Okay, there's a lot of debate. Again, we'll get to it more when we get into Revelation, like the Battle of Armageddon. Who is fighting whom? Okay, there's one group that says it's a lot of these countries, because it seems like this, once this guy took power and declared himself to be God, everything is going to go in a completely horrible plot. Obviously, it's his fault, so let's go and conquer him. And so all these nations come to destroy him. There's others that think, no, they're going to go and destroy the remainders of the Jews. We're going to look into it more. That's more for that particular topic.
They don't realize they're dealing with demons and the devil.
So basically, based on Daniel 12, and then, this is about as deep as we'll get right now, one possible scenario seems to look like this. Okay, Antichrist is going to be leading one of these 10 confederated nations in the territory of the old Roman Empire. That seems pretty clear. Now he's going to overcome three other nations, and then with the help of Satan, he's going to move in to become a world dictator. Okay? Now he appears to have working solutions to all the problems that the world has to deal with. There's probably going to be very little opposition to this. At first, he's going to appear friendly to the Jews, giving them a 7-year covenant to protect them, and that's when the tribulation starts. Is at that signing of the covenant, okay? And this is the start. Again, we're going to talk about Daniel's 70 weeks. That's later in Daniel, but we'll talk about that later. That's outlined in chapter 9. And this is the beginning of the Great Tribulation period, okay? Yeah, wrath of God's going to continue to come down, but right now people are just going to rally behind the beast, okay? Like, in Revelation they talk about one head is wounded and comes back, okay? May have something to do with that. We don't know. We'll get to that when we get to Revelation 13, all right? Then after the 3.5-year period, the Antichrist is going to break that covenant, set up his own image in the Jewish temple in Jerusalem, forcing the world to worship him and the devil, who's energizing him. And this, according to the language of Daniel 11, okay, Jesus called this the abomination of desolation. Now, we're going to talk about that in the next chapter, okay, because there's actually a type and an archetype, as they say. There's actually a double prophecy here. We'll get to that later. Now, this signals the last half of the tribulation period, and it's going to climax with the return of Jesus Christ to the earth, the defeat of the Antichrist and his army, a day of judgment when the beast's empire and the world system will be destroyed. There's a court, and they're going to, the beast or the Antichrist is going to come in. He's going to continue to blaspheme, and God's basically going to throw him into the lake of fire with, not with Satan at this point. We'll get to that later. At this point, Jesus is placed on the throne, and you start the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which then turns into the eternal reign of God. There's not going to be any rebellious elements left among the surviving inhabitants of the earth. It's all going to be handed over to the saints, to us. So obviously Daniel didn't go into all the details that John does in the book of Revelation. The two are meant to be complementary, okay, not contradictory. But he does assure us that the kingdom of Satan and his counterfeit Christ are going to be defeated and destroyed. Now, the saints mentioned throughout this chapter, okay, that refers to the people of God living on the earth during the Great Tribulation period. The church is already going to be raptured, but as we mentioned, there are going to be people who become Christians during that time. You have 144,000 Jews who see Christ as a Messiah. They're going to be out doing their missionary work. You're going to have people who became Christians because of either they heard the word, the seeds were planted in some way, and they only came to believe after everyone disappeared, or secondhand, they said, no, let me tell you what happened, and boom, people become believers.
And so there are witnesses that are
Yes.
brought down.
Yeah, the two witnesses will also be talking about the two.
The Holy Spirit leaves with us, though, correct?
So anyway, but John basically says, as we said, these people, I lost my place. That's okay. We believe, and again, this is a question a lot of people ask, is how are you so certain the church is going to leave before the tribulation? The answer is God never judges his faithful. Okay? The tribulation is judgment. Okay? It is judgment. Now, we do not know the timing of the rapture. What we do know is we are not meant to face the wrath of God, but, and this is a big one, we have to understand that the Bible says nothing about facing the wrath of the world, or the wrath of Satan for that matter. God's going to protect us. Remember, Jesus said they're going to hate you because they hated me. Okay? So that's why we are going to see a lot of the run-up to what's happening here. We're going to see it's getting harder and harder to be Christians. We see it, depending on where you go, we see it in our country in different places already. Okay? It's not here yet, but it's coming. At some point it is going to come. But we take take peace that God's not going to judge his faithful. Okay? So we actually may see this run-up to the covenant. We actually find out who the Antichrist is. We don't know. Doesn't matter. We're not to look for Antichrist. We're to look for Jesus Christ. Okay? So as I mentioned, the wearing down of the saints is already happening. Okay? And what's kind of sad is that the church as a whole, and I'm not talking about our church, but the church as a whole, basically is sleeping through it. Okay? It's in our history, it's interesting to note, if we look throughout history, part of what kept our nation and Europe standing firm early on, and we're talking back in the 18th and 19th century, was the preaching of the word from the different pulpits. No one was afraid to speak the word of truth, and people spread it. And somewhere down the line, the church decided, instead of fighting the battle, let's walk off the battlefield. Well, it's easier that way. And we see people today, and you've heard me make fun of the people who, and no, Kelly, you're not one of them, that their ministry is the coffee bar, and they sit there, this is my service, but have you reached an unsaved person today? Well, the thing is that if that's all that person does and nothing else, they don't talk to people, they just serve at the coffee bar, they're sitting on the back lines. They're not really even helping because coffee you don't need anyway, not to fight this battle. Okay? It's beyond coffee at this point. We have to understand. That's why, I'd like to go more into humanism so people understand it, but I think I've hit the main points of it. You have to understand that it's all around us. It's all around us. We need to make sure that we ground ourselves in the Word so we know what we believe and we know why there's an absolute right or wrong, and we know that they are wrong because we see the hands of the devil behind it.
See, what I got out of it was that he was eventually going to take the Bibles from us. We need to know what the Word says. We need to know.
Isn't it already in Canada that it's against the law to preach on certain topics?
Yeah.
Things that are against homosexuality.
The main point is, as a church and as Christians, we need to still share the gospel with everyone. Because we don't know what seeds are being planted. And again, remember, a lot of those seeds planted, even if they don't become believers before the rapture, they will afterwards. Okay? We don't know who. Some are going to wake up from sleep, realizing they ignored the warnings, and they'll realize they're in a bad position. And many are going to be killed. But again, Jesus never said it was going to be a walk in the park. That's a myth that has gone through a lot of the church, that if they're having hard times, well, Jesus, I gave my life to you. What's happening? You're being a Christian. As I've said, if you're undergoing persecution or any hard times because of something you're doing something right. Because Satan's upset with you. Okay? So, this is the end of chapter 7, and this is a dramatic vision. I mean, Daniel had seen basically a vast sweep of history, and it's interesting how he responded. It's like, oh, his face turned pale. You know, his countenance changed, which means he was not a happy man. But I don't think because of what he saw. I think it was just disturbed him so much it had a negative physical reaction on him. In fact, when we hit chapter 8, he was actually, at the end, it's going to tell him that vision's going to basically, he's going to be ill for 6 months. Okay? Still able to do his work, but not feeling good at all. And, you know, it's interesting to compare Daniel. He kind of kept it to himself, and we know he was kind of told to keep it to himself. We look at prophetic students of today. They go on TV or radio, and they talk about how, we've got this great truth, and we cracked the code. We know when Jesus is going to return, or we know who the Antichrist is, or who the 144,000 truly are. Some such nonsense as that. No, that's it. It's a dangerous thing to study prophecy and then try to read things into it that God didn't put there. Okay? Yeah. And, divine truth, here's the thing. If divine truth doesn't touch our own hearts and affect our conduct, then our Bible study is nothing more than an intellectual exercise that could inflate our own ego and cause others to stumble. Okay? And that's the point, is I study the Bible. I don't talk a lot about it except to people who ask. But I certainly don't sit there, I read this many chapters a day and I do this and I do. No, that's not the point. I'm doing it for my own thing, for my own, as a pastor, I need to feed. And that's how I feed, is through Bible study. But here's another warning we have from this chapter. We need to stand strong, not as a church, but as individual Christians. Right is right, wrong is wrong. We cannot pretend like we're the Church of Philadelphia in the book of Revelation, when actually we're the Church of Laodicea, which is so wishy-washy. Jesus says that he's going to, the translation is spit them out of his mouth in the King James, or spew, pardon me. Spew means vomit. I mean, we're talking eject it completely, bazooka barfing type thing. You are so sickening, I get you out of my system as fast as I can. And a good portion of the church in America sits in Laodicea right now. But they, we do this and we do that. It doesn't really matter. There are two types of churches, okay? And this has been true since the early church, since the day of the Caesars. You have type A. Type A stands and suffers. Then there's type B, compromise and coast, hoping that it all blows over. And your type A church is going to suffer, produce many martyrs, yield much fruit, and ultimately they're the seeds for the next round of growth when the church collapses, or the culture collapses of its own weight. Okay? Type B, on the other hand, conforms to the system, compromises their beliefs, sometimes makes life miserable for the suffering type A churches, but become so watered down that they are indistinguishable from the culture and are indeed really a part of it. Okay? Let us be the type A church.
Amen.
That's what we have to be, because compromise is a process, not an instantaneous event. It takes place over time, because that's the easy way. So we need to make sure that we don't fall for it. We can't reverse the entire process of the culture. I don't think we're meant to, because this is the plan of God.
Amen.
Okay? Yeah, we can change for change in leadership in state, government, federal government, and so forth. We can change for the culture, pray for the culture to change. But to be honest, I don't think it's going to. And it's not because of lack of prayer. It's because that's not God's will.
Right. That's why it's progressing in spite of.
Exactly. Because God's letting it happen.
It has
So,
to. It has to, or Revelation's never going to come.
Right.
It
Exactly.
This is like the inevitable.
It is exciting because you know Jesus is on the way.
Exactly.
He's fine.
And here's the thing is that another sign, and this is how the church, another sign of how humanism entered the church. It's interesting how most biblical adjectives and verbs imply conflict. For example, to contend, to run, to win, to race, to stand, to fight, to resist, to defend. Okay? In defense of the faith. That's what we're supposed to do. And yeah, onward Christian soldiers. You realize how unpopular that hymn is because of the military aspect of it? That's the way it's supposed to be. Yeah. Don't let them fool you. We need to fight. We need to stand firm in our beliefs and take our lumps because they are going to come.
Yep. And it's spiritual warfare.
Father, we thank you again for this time we've had together, and we thank you for the insights from Daniel 7 and the importance of how our culture is out to destroy us as a church. But we know, Father, that the gates of hell cannot prevail against it. And as a result, Father, we ask you to put in our hearts that boldness, that courage to face down the fires of the enemy, all the attacks they have, to be able to form, just to stand firm for you, no matter what the cost. Not to compromise, even if threatened. Yeah, there's going to be a time where it's going to get so bad that maybe we will not be able to buy and sell anything. Not because of the mark of the beast, but because some government decides to lock us out of our bank accounts. It has happened already, even in Canada. Not to Christians, but to people who are not on the side of the government. With electronics, Father, that's very possible. But we thank you that we do not need to fear about that. You have our backs. You're just there for us. And for that, Father, we give you all the glory and all the honor. And so, Father, as we leave today, give us that boldness to stand firm. And having done all to stand, putting all the armor of God on, not neglecting anything. Amen. And Father, we just look forward to your return. When we see these things happening, we are to look up because our redemption is drawing near. As we leave today, Father, give us traveling mercies home. Thank you again for the snow and the rain, but give us safe passage as we head home. And as we clean up, protect our backs and knees and feet and all the things that are hurting right now. But Father, we look forward to that day when this tent goes aside and you give us our heavenly bodies. We praise you, Father. We thank you in Jesus' precious name. Amen.